Jeremy Daly joins us in studio this morning. He's a physician assistant at Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, located on Fillmore Street, directly across from the main post office. That's on the north side of town. Bill Colley answering the telephones as well this morning at 736-0300. Segment is called Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine, and thank you for joining us on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We've got 58 coming up on 834. First of all, Jeremy, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Glad to be here.
I was just sharing with people off air before you got in here that we were going to be talking about bites, especially this time of year because we're talking some insect bites. But you're outside a lot more often. You've got animals. Uh, if you've got a farm, you've got to be careful. If you've got horses, because sometimes they like to bite. I mean, there's any number of threats. I mean, I won't say threat, but you got to be a little careful, even around domestic livestock and domestic animals, pets and the like, this
Oh
time of
yeah,
year.
definitely. I mean, it's something that, we tend to be outside more often, obviously during the summer, and that just increases our exposure and risk to being around animals. And really the thing that spurred this topic today was the fact that recently the health department had released a public, just a letter to the public basically saying, and I think it's something they do every year based on my research, but I think because of things like Facebook, it got spread around a little bit more quickly than it should or it typically does, and created a little bit of public concern. So that's something I'd been hearing about a little bit this week. So something I wanted to address is that specifically, and then talk about some other animals that we worry about as far as bite risks and infections and things like that.
This time of year, I think the one that we're most aware of is because in the heat. And my parents used to tell me on the hot summer days, don't bother the dogs too much if they were sleeping outside, because they can be a little unruly if it's really hot out, and a dog bite is nothing to mess with.
Definitely not. And statistically, it actually makes up for about 90% of all animal bites in the US. So it is something that, you should be cognizant of. Dogs, whether being playful or being aggressive, can break the skin and basically increase your risk for infection and damage to things like tendons in the hand. And statistics are there that show that dogs that are overly aggressive can actually cause death, especially in children and infants and things like that. And kind of that's something that I wanted to talk about today, as far as just preventing those types of situations and what we can do to basically deal with them if they do happen, because they do happen.
What's the first thing you do? Do you just be aware of the surroundings? Is that maybe a place to start?
Yeah, I think definitely being aware of your surroundings, and if you're near a dog that you're not familiar with, don't feel like you can go up and pet them. I know we all want to be friendly to animals, and if they look cute, we want to pet them. But being aware of what type of animal it is and what breed of dog it is, things like that can make a big difference, as far as you know, can be more aggressive and their bites can be more dangerous to you. So, even if they look cute, even if they look friendly, it doesn't mean that they are friendly. And, getting to know the dog before you actually go up and pet it makes a big difference. Even knowing the vaccination status of the dog.
I had a situation a few weeks ago where I accidentally, right here at work, stepped on the toes of a cat I didn't realize was standing right next to me. And of course, the cat's reaction is just, it doesn't think, but it grabbed me with both legs and claws, tried to bite my leg, and then ran off. I mean, it was a defense mechanism, I'm sure. But again, there you go. I was not quite aware of my surroundings. I didn't look down. I didn't see what happened to be there in that situation.
Yeah, and accidents do happen. And so, when they do happen, when you get bit or scratched by an animal, whether it be a domesticated animal or a wild animal, it's important to know what to do. And, I want to talk about some statistics as far as specific types of domestic animals. And like we talked about the bats earlier, that's one thing I want to address right off the bat. First of all, statistically, there is, bats are they're natural carriers for rabies, and I think that's the concern that a lot of people have is, oh, I'm going to get rabies from a bat. But if you look at the statistics, especially in Idaho over the past decade, the average that they're finding in these bats, and it's about 10% of bats that are brought in that are actually found with rabies. It's about 10 to 20 a year that end up being found with rabies. Now, other animals that are actually found with rabies, it seems like over the past decade, there's been about one a year that's actually been diagnosed with a rabies infection, and most recently, I think they've been skunks. So unless you're hanging around with a lot of skunks or bats, your actual risk of developing a rabies infection is very, very low.
Bat bites are rare too, aren't they?
Very rare. Most of the time we avoid those and they avoid us, and so there's no issue. Some of the situations that can be a little bit questionable are if you wake up with a bat in your room and you don't know what it's been doing all night. Well, what do you do? Well, definitely be evaluated. It's important to go in and do a full skin check and make sure there's no evidence of puncture wounds or anything like that. But that being said, there's no reason why you should have, what's called post exposure prophylaxis, where they actually treat you for rabies after you've been exposed. They give you the vaccinations in order to keep you from developing a rabies infection. But like I said, the risk is so low that it's almost one of those things that we hesitate to address because you don't want to make people too worried. But if you do have any exposure to things like that, just come in and be evaluated. That's the bottom line.
Talk more about that coming up with Jeremy Dowley, physician assistant from Tripp Family Medicine in Twin Falls. It's coming up on 840. 57. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com, and this is Better Health. Our guest in the studio, Jeremy Dowley, is with us from Tripp Family Medicine, and that's right here in Twin Falls, Idaho, located on Fillmore Street across from the main post office. And Jeremy is talking with us about animal bites today and just some of the precautions and some of the dangers and the like, and been sharing some numbers with us too on all of this. Uh, what's the first thing someone should do though if they are bitten? Should they wash the wound quickly and try to clean it out at that point?
Yeah, definitely. You want to make sure that if you're in a place where you can wash it off, just use soap and water. One thing that I'd caution people to use is something like hydrogen peroxide. It's commonly used and kind of, the thought process is it cleans out wounds great, and it does. But one thing that it also does is it delays wound healing. Damages tissue to the point where sometimes it doesn't heal quite as quickly.
Right.
And so we caution people to use those types of things. So soap and water is usually good enough, and then get yourself an appointment, especially if it's something that needs to be evaluated for stitches, or if it's an animal that you don't know, you're not familiar with who that animal is and what their vaccination status is. When I was in the emergency room down in El Paso, we had a lot of dog bites, a lot. And the protocol was, we had to keep that person there. We had to get a hold of animal control, and animal control had to locate the animal. And, if we could determine vaccination status, that was great. But it was a long process, and it took some time just to make sure that there was no risk of any type of after injury to the patient, as far as developing a virus or specific type of infection that the dog may have not been vaccinated for, may have been infected with. And so it was quite the process that we had to do. And the fact of the matter is, there had been no rabies in El Paso for, geez, like 50 years. No rabies in dogs, or no rabies in humans at all. And so it seemed like a lot of work for nothing. But we want to make sure that patients are safe, and so that's basically the protocol that we have.
When you're bitten by a dog, I think probably some of the worst medical issues would be from the tearing. That's just because they'll pull that. If a dog is vicious, it bites and it tears. Being bitten by a cat is an entirely different type of thing, though, because, and as I understand it, a cat bite can be much more infectious than any dog bite.
Oh, very, very much more infectious. And if you look at the statistics, like we talked about earlier, dog bites account for 80 to 90% of all bites in the U.S. Cat bites are about 5 to 10% of all bites. But as far as how often cat bites become infected, it's about 20% of the time, where dog bites are about 5 to 10 at the most. So it's a lot bigger deal if you get bitten by a cat. And really the reason is the type of bacteria that are on their teeth in their mouth, and on their claws. And so, typically within 24 hours, we really see a big change as far as the infection setting on, and it can progress really quickly.
I had a grandmother who would have nothing to do with cats, and that's because when she was a little girl in the early part of the last century, one of her relatives died from what was called cat scratch fever,
Hmm.
and that was related obviously to an infection, and so that became probably at the time they didn't have abilities to treat those things as we would today. So if it happens today, you likely have better courses of treatment you could go through.
No, certainly we can almost always take care of those types of infections. I mean, typically, the treatment is antibiotics. Sometimes it's actually surgical debridement. And we had talked about this a little bit earlier. If you get a cat bite on the hand, um, which is the most common place to get a cat bite, typically, it's on the upper extremity. Um, if you get on, especially the palm side of the hand, there's a big risk for something called flexor tendinosynovitis, where that tendon sheath, the sheath that surrounds the tendons of the hand, actually becomes infected and it spreads very, very quickly. And if it's not taken care of, typically by surgical debridement, where they open it up and actually just clean everything out, there's a big risk for permanent damage to the hand. And so it has to be addressed very quickly if you get a bite like that on the hand, and it's not something to mess around with.
Insect bites, probably maybe not quite as critical in Idaho. We don't have the mosquito population that a state with a lot more moisture would have, but I'm sure that we're dealing still with some of those in the summertime, especially too.
Yeah, yeah, we do run into things like insect bites, and most of the time it's when people come into the clinic, their question is, "Well, what kind of bite is this?" Which is hard. Honestly, that's a really hard thing to determine. When you have a little bump that's red, swollen, and itchy, it could have been a lot of things. But typically we're dealing with mosquito bites, ant bites, and things like that. But most of the time the treatment is really pretty simple. It's something like an antihistamine cream, so a Benadryl cream, or sometimes oral Benadryl if it's a lot more itchy and uncomfortable. But other than that, it's really just time when it comes to things like that.
I got a bite one time when I was a kid on one of my fingers on the right hand from I think it was a yellow jacket, and for a day the finger was so swollen I couldn't bend it at the joints. By the next day, of course, I had the movement back, but then I had a large, almost looked like a blood blister on the finger for a couple of weeks while it healed. And obviously, that reaction just was limited just to that local area. But some people have reactions far, far worse than that.
Oh yeah. One of the things that we worry about in people that are severely allergic is called anaphylaxis, where it's a systemic total body reaction and it affects everything, including the respiratory system. So they end up, if they don't get treatment quickly enough, they can actually basically suffocate. They have swelling of the airway and they can become very sick very quickly if they don't get the care that they need.
And these are the people who often walk around with their own epinephrine kit, right? And they take care of this if they get a bite.
Right. Yeah. If they know that they have the allergies, people are usually pretty good about bringing around an EpiPen, whether it's in their car, or some people carry them on their person all the time. So if they have severe allergies, and so that can save someone's life really quickly.
We had a neighbor who had that with her, and she got a bite one night from a bee or a wasp or something in the neighborhood, and she ended up taking her shot and out of her kit. But then she ended up sitting on her porch all night wide awake because this thing had. I guess it has an effect like that. It's like a bit of a what do you call it? Stimulant.
Yeah. Well, epinephrine is um, what we call adrenaline. So it's actually liquid adrenaline, and so you get injected with that, and your heart rate goes up, and you feel like you're ready to run a marathon.
It's 8:51, and Jeremy Daly is our guest. He is here from Tripp Family Medicine. Telephone number if you'd like to reach our program today. Maybe you have a comment or question too, or you've gone through something like this and you need someone to point you in the right direction. The telephone number is 736-0300. That's 736-0300. We call the segment Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine here on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And we're at 59 on our way perhaps to low 80s somewhere today before we come to a close. And I'd have to say, too, the other one that I would think is probably common in this area with all the livestock people have is occasionally. I've had horses nip at me, and I know that can be pretty dangerous, too, if you get bitten by an animal that large.
I can imagine it would be, and I've seen some horse bites, and most of the time it just blisters up really good. But there's not, as far as I know, there's not as much of a risk for infection unless they break the skin. I'd imagine it's pretty similar to human bites or something of that nature. But I haven't dealt with horse bites as much, so that's a good question. I'll have to look into horse bites.
And then we've got the wild animals. I was driving down a highway the other day, and there was a dead fox in the middle of the road, and you realize we're dealing in Idaho and really throughout the Northwest with a lot of, maybe not too many deadly snakes in the Magic Valley, but you don't have to go far from here, and you're going to be dealing with either viper bites or You do encounter a wild animal like that, if you surprise them, they may bite. Those are instances where you're going to have a much more serious threat, I would imagine, especially if you're in the outback.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So specifically, snake bites. A lot of times we get really concerned quickly about how we should take care of those, and you see the old movies where people they get down there and they suck out the venom and spit it out, and John Wayne movies and the like, and really that's not a good idea for a couple of reasons. It's not safe for you and not really proven to be very effective. So most of the time, the best treatment is getting someone to your emergency room so that they can get an anti-venom. That's the best treatment for those patients.
One of my coworkers told me that the main problem with snakes around here would be bull snakes, which aren't necessarily poisonous, but those are still pretty sharp teeth that go through your skin, and I would assume that even if it's not a poisonous snake, you better go see the doctor or the physician assistant in that situation.
Yeah, I think so, just to make sure that it doesn't become infected, or if it needs to be repaired, we definitely don't want it to look like, you know, as it scars, sometimes we let things heal by what's called secondary intention, meaning we don't do anything about it. But most bites can be repaired, and we'll treat with antibiotics to prevent infection from setting on, but you don't need to have a deformity or a large scar unnecessarily. So just getting some stitches a lot of times can take care of that.
And probably much more common among the wild animals if you get a bite that you're going to be exposed to rabies than, let's say, to domestic animals.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, according to the statistics in Idaho, excuse me, the biggest thing is really the bats and occasionally a wild animal like a skunk. There was one case of a horse that had rabies. So yeah, that horse bite would have been a bad deal. But for the most part, the things that we're worried about as far as domestic animals are bacterial type infections. And wild animals can be bacterial, but also there's a lot of viruses that they carry that they're not vaccinated for. So I think that the take home message most of the time is one, don't play with or mess around with animals you don't know, or wild animals for that matter. They you can enjoy them from afar. Make sure that your pets are vaccinated, that they're up to date on all the vaccines that they can have, making sure that they're up to date on things like tetanus, well, not tetanus, the rabies vaccination, and making sure that you keep them away from animals if you can as much as possible.
I know we're kind of running short on time here, and this one's probably not on the list, but when I was a boy, there was a kid in the neighborhood named Greg, and he was about 3, 4 years old, and he was a notorious biter in the sense that he thought it was funny to bite other kids. Are there ever any dangers from something like that happening?
That's actually the last thing that was on my list today was to talk about human bites, and the most common being something called a fight bite. Which is basically the bite mark on the fist after someone being punched in the face. They catch the end of the teeth with their knuckles,
Hmm.
and yeah, they can turn into infections quite often. So we do treat those with antibiotics a lot of times to prevent infections, and watching out for signs of infections is really important with any type of bite, whether it's a human bite, an animal bite, um, scratches, or anything like that. Looking out for redness, swelling, tenderness, warmth, and signs of pus draining from that area would be signs of infection that need to be evaluated and potentially be treated with something like an antibiotic to prevent further spread of that infection.
I just think that it's interesting because people worry about kids who do that. He ended up growing up to be one of the nicest men you can ever meet in the neighborhood. But as a kid, he just found that to be terribly amusing. And his mother, when she found out about it, I think basically set him straight uh, to the point of tears. But we won't go into that. Parenting is a different subject. For people who are tuning in today, if they would like some contact information for the office, I know you're looking for new patients and you have that policy about trying to see people on the same day. If they call and they have an issue, how should they go about contacting Trip Family Medicine?
Yeah, you can get a hold of us at 933-4400. That's our phone number. Or come see us if you are close to the clinic and want to drop in. It's right across from the post office on Fillmore, and we're happy to try to get you in on the same day. Most of the time, we can take care of that. New patients, sometimes it's tougher, but we try our best to get people in. And if we can't get you in today, it's usually the next day we can get you in.
things are back to normal now that you're back to full staff after the doctor's mission trip.
Right. Yeah, we were running kind of on a maybe a little bit of a skeleton crew there for a while, but yep, Dr. Tripp is back, and we're getting back into the full swing of things and seeing all the patients that we want to see so far.
I just want to remind people that on Friday morning, Dr. Tripp will be in studio with us, actually for a discussion about his family's mission to Nicaragua. And we would hope that you would tune in to hear that as well, because there are obviously going to be some fascinating stories about what life is like there and probably the medical challenges. Uh, this is this is probably a good lesson in the sense that we have some blessings here that they don't have in other parts of the world. Jeremy, thank you for coming by.
Thanks, Bill.
We'll talk to you again soon. And coming up in just a moment, Fox News. That'll be here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com at 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you for one more hour on Top Story.